Kamaitachi Yoru is many things. It's one of the first games to really put Chunsoft as a company on the map. It's a surprisingly complicated story, considering it was developed for the Super Famicom of all things. And finally, it could also be considered as one of the very first big visual novels that really brought the medium into the limelight. Granted, they actually called it a sound novel and coined the term, but that's mostly because visual novels weren't really that big of a thing back then, and sound novels are now considered a subsection of visual novels. The question I want to pose, however, considering the fact that Spike Chunsoft released a remake to one of their biggest successes in Kamaitachi Yoru Rinne Saisei, and that remake somehow also got a fan translation, is whether this remake is worth playing in current times, or is it more of a piece of history sort of thing? I will say, regardless of whether you think Kamaitachi Yoru is amazing or terrible, no one can deny how much of an impact it had. It not only popularized the concept of visual novels to a more mainstream audience, but it also created its own subgenre of mystery novel games. Whenever you see a live-action mystery adventure novel come out, like Haruyuki te Netoro Chika from Square Enix, its existence is probably thanks to just how popular Kamaitachi Yoru became way back in 1994. Visual novels today might not be at the place they are currently if not for Kamaitachi Yoru's success. Is it one of the very first visual novels to ever come out? No, not at all. There have been plenty beforehand. However, it is one of the first to bring the medium to a wider public audience, thanks to the fact that it came out on the incredibly popular Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo as it's known internationally, as opposed to say a PC-88 or PC-98 release, which was much more commonplace for visual novels at the time. And if any of you have tried messing around with PC-88 software, you would know how much of a pain it is to get running, as opposed to say a Super Famicom where all you have to do is pop the game in and start playing. I would say in terms of how much of an impact it had on the medium, I would rank it among the greats like The Girl Who Chants Love at the Bounds of This World, and Snatcher from Kojima. Now, the difference here is that while I think the original PC-98 is still an amazing experience even in present times, and Snatcher on a PlayStation or Sega Mega CD can be a fun short ride, the SNES Kamaitachi Yoru hasn't aged quite as gracefully as the other two. While I can highly recommend giving either or Snatcher a shot if you want to see a piece of visual novel history, I even did a video on the Yoru Remake where I talk about both versions if you are curious about it, I can't say the same for Kamaitachi Yoru. And that's why we're talking about the remake for today, because I'm sure we're all kind of curious if a modern remake can bring fresh life to what is definitely a legacy title. Kamaitachi Yoru Rinne Saisei, or the remake, was first released in 2007 on the PS Vita, later ported to Windows in 2018, and then finally released a fan translation from the folks at Project Kamai late last year. There is technically an official English translation of a port of the original game on the iOS store, but that actually isn't accessible anymore, and it heavily localizes the game, removes some routes, so we'll be talking about this version instead. There's also Shin Kamaitachi Yoru, which is the fourth game in the series, and it's not English translated, so don't worry about it. As a remake, considering the fact that the original was made by the same company, it is incredibly faithful to its 1994 SNES counterpart. They both follow the story of Toru and Mari, two young adults who end up staying at a ski lodge up in the middle of nowhere, owned by Mira's uncle. What at first seems to be like any other day, ends up quickly turning into a murder mystery once one of the inhabitants receive a threatening message saying someone would die at 12. And soon after, a body is found chopped up outside the lodge. If it wasn't immediately obvious from what I just said, Kamaitachi Yoru's story at its heart is a murder mystery whodunit kind of story. All of the characters find themselves locked up in a secluded environment, in this case a ski lodge, and are unable to get out and find help thanks to an ongoing blizzard. There is a set cast of characters, and it's obvious from the get-go that someone within the cast we are quickly introduced to is the one responsible for the murders that just happened, and are about to continue happening. This remake adds in an extra scenario by Ryukishi07, who's famous for Higurashi and Umineko, but more importantly than that, it also comes with an updated soundtrack, full voice acting, which brings to life all the characters alongside the new art, which is big because in the original, everyone was basically a blue silhouette. The art is great at portraying everything it needs to and gives a lot of the characters more personality than they would otherwise have in the original. As for whether that art is necessarily better than how the original portrayed everything, not really. I think it's more of a matter of preference. Personally, I like the fact that there is new art more, but it does end up with some problems later, as we'll see. The script for the game is also pretty much ripped straight from the original. I didn't compare every single line, but playing through the beginning of the SNES version and comparing it to the beginning of Rinne Saisei, even the dumb comedic parts and dated references are completely intact. Speaking of which, you all probably already know that when it comes to fan translations, I tend to be a lot less critical than if it's official translation, mostly since fan translations are usually done by fans for free and don't have as big of a staff working on it. That said, yeah, the translation as far as I can tell looks perfectly fine. There are some weird bits here and there, awkward sentence structures, tiny spelling errors, or just sounding strange to say out loud, but for the most part, it flows perfectly well from beginning to end. To be perfectly frank, I think they did a far better job than the official translation of another Mage's remake, Yuno. Let's start by talking about what I like about Kamaitachi no Yoru, and this goes both for the original and this remake. I think how the game presents all the different routes is actually fairly interesting conceptually. While the main route is a basic whodunit murder mystery that only comprises one portion of the game. After completing that first chapter, you then start unlocking all the other side routes by running through different parts of the game. In a fairly unique experience, these side routes utilize the same environment and character appearances, but puts them in entirely different roles, personalities, and stories. So a quiet introvert who quickly gets murdered in one story may turn into a spy from France in another, and Kamaitachi might move from a folklore concept into some sort of secret weapon. It's a pretty cool concept that really makes use of the limited resources to tell several other stories. It's also a great way to twist people's expectations from how every character acts in the main route, which they kind of utilize to some small degree. The sheer amount of what they do with so little is pretty impressive. Considering they are working with a pretty basic visual novel choice engine, they go to some pretty strange places. I think the script can also make for some laughs, even if at times it feels like they are trying a little too hard to be plain wacky. The main character's reactions feel larger than life, which I assume comes from the fact that in the original versions, characters didn't have much in the way of visuals. It gets a little much though, especially stuff like this nonsense exchange between Mary and the main character that doesn't really lead anywhere. I can't say I'm a fan of when it gets too nonsensical, and it seems like it's there for the sake of being dumb as opposed to advancing or showing anything. When it rings it in a bit, the script can make for some laughs, although that seems to be more laughing at the main character's insane leaps of logic, which I can't tell if the writer wrote it that way on purpose or it's just a funny coincidence. The voice actors also all do a fine job. The fact that the voice actor for the main character of Demon Bane also voices Toshio is pretty dang hilarious to me, but that's probably because ever since I heard his voice in that game, anytime I hear him in anything at all, the only thing that appears in my mind is Daijuji Kuro getting yelled at by Al-Azif. Moving on to the story, for better or for worse, Kamaitachi no Yoru's main plot plays out exactly like you would imagine any ski lodge murder mystery will. If you've seen any show or story use the exact same premise like Detective Conan, everything you expect to happen will probably happen, which, to be fair, this came out before Detective Conan, so technically, that show would have ripped this game off. For the sake of spoilers, I'm not gonna get into it, but there are two things that I can say about Kamaitachi no Yoru's main plot. First is, like I just mentioned, it's painfully predictable, although at the time, it might have been more innovative. For all I know, perhaps the reason why the ski lodge murder mystery idea is so prevalent was thanks to this game. The second thing is that I'm not a fan of how close Kamaitachi no Yoru sticks to horror B-movie conventions. For whatever reason, all the characters do what I can only describe as the most idiotic thing possible in order to get themselves all killed. In a horror B-movie, this is usually done to play up the whole horror aspect, and the movie prepares this by making all the characters so thoroughly unlikable so that we are kind of rooting for the monsters to give these characters their comeuppance. Aside from the one or two good main characters, of course. I feel like in a visual novel, however, when we are meant to have some sort of control over our main character, it feels really bad when we are forced to watch them make terrible decisions without being able to affect things. Which is funny to say considering how many inconsequential choices you make throughout the game. Take for example here at this point in the game near the end. Pretty much everyone's already dying and our main character hears a scream and decides to check it out. The only girl he's really trying to protect is Mari, the main heroine, so instead of bringing her over with him, he decides to tell her to stay in the room and he'll go by himself to check it out. Now, let's go over how many different ways this is a terrible decision. For one, if the killer is actually down there, then our main character is walking in to die on his own without any backup. 2, the killer could easily go in and kill Mari, the girl he wants to protect in any number of ways while he's downstairs. 3, it throws suspicion on Toru because what if Mari comes later and sees the main character looking over a dead body when everyone is paranoid of each other. And 4, if Mari is the actual killer, then it gives her free reign to do whatever she wants without any oversight. It's such a monumentally stupid decision, and the fact is that all the characters continually do these things over and over throughout the route. It's one thing that characters you don't control make these terrible decisions that get them killed. It's another thing entirely when the main character you are supposed to be influencing seems like he has a constant death wish. When it comes to main characters in visual novels, I tend to lean towards the more capable main characters. I like my protagonist being proactive and kicking all sorts of tail, and Toru is pretty firmly on the other side of the spectrum. The writing feels like it makes everyone incredibly incompetent so that they can run through every single horror trope as fast as humanly possible. It probably doesn't help either that this entire story takes place in the duration of a single night, so the fact that everyone managed to die in a span of less than half of a day is kind of ridiculous. It really speaks to just how insanely incompetent everyone has to be to end with this result. Usually to get a kill count like that, there has to be something supernatural going on. At this point, I think it's fairly obvious how I generally feel about the main story of Kamaitachi no Yoru. Still, Kamaitachi no Yoru as an experience is about more than just the initial murder mystery you have to play first. I'd wager in total playtime, it's probably about half the way there, with all the other scenarios that are pretty much unrelated to the main plot, making up the rest of the story. Considering I have to get into spoilers to talk about any of them, however, I'll be leaving the rest for a future spoiler route ranking video that will come out pretty soon, linked at the end when it comes out. Earlier, I posed the question of whether Kamaitachi no Yoru Rinne Saisei was worth playing in modern times. I already stated that I thought the original was a pretty so-so experience, and even with a visual update, voice acting, a new soundtrack, and new scenarios, my mind hasn't really changed too much as a whole. I feel like most of the things I can appreciate come from a place of, I bet that was interesting at the time more than being wowed by it currently. A lot of the gimmickier things that happen in future routes probably would have been far more surprising if I hadn't already seen every single one of them being done already in one of Chunsoft's later sound novels, 428 Shibuya Scramble, which is honestly a way more interesting game if you're cool with real life actors. When I saw stuff like the Chunsoft Conspiracy and a maze section, my thoughts about them were more like, oh okay, they're doing this again, rather than, oh boy, another bullshit maze section. Even if this is your first run-in with all of these different techniques, I feel like the stories they're trying to tell are not inherently interesting, and the gimmicks kinda wear thin really fast because they exist for the sake of showing them off rather than being a part of any actual plot. The way they try to stretch the choose your own adventure medium is more interesting to learn about than actually playing through it. Maybe what I'm saying will make a ton more sense once we actually run through everything together in the spoiler story route ranking coming out in a bit. For now, I'll leave it at that. If you want to talk about Kamaitachi no Yoru, feel free to do so in the comments section. I know some people have fond memories of the original SFC version with the blue silhouettes, so feel free to share those if you got any, or if you want to talk smack about, or even praise this remake. Anywho, all the supportive stuff are in the same place as always. Like, subscribe, notifications, and with that, I'll see you later. Till next time.